Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we go for another fun-filled lesson in world history. This time it's lesson 2B, and we're going to be switching our interest from focusing just on Europe to looking a little bit at the continents of Africa and Asia, and specifically what was going on with the European influence in those areas based on exploration and colonization that we talked about last time. So, speaking of last time, here's what we talked about. We looked at why Europeans had an interest in exploration. We decided it came pretty much down to money, money, money. We looked at some of the major trading empires, the Spanish and the Portuguese. We talked a little bit about their voyages to the Americas and what their hope was for colonization of North and South America. And finally, we looked at the economic impact of exploration on other folks and the Europeans. So what was the whole hope there with their improving their economic situation. So for this time, I'm going to ask you guys to do some reading. It's going to be dealing with the influence in Africa and Asia. It's the completion of chapter 13 that you started last time in lesson 2A, and you're looking at pages 415 to 422. So as before, take a quick look at this information, then go ahead and read that, and you'll be ready to go. So the preview of today, we're going to talk a little bit about the African slave trade. Obviously a critical issue in Africa, and obviously one in the United States with our history as well. You cannot separate us away from what was going on during this time frame in terms of taking individuals and bringing them over to what will eventually become the United States. The political structure in Africa. There were great nations in Africa well before the Europeans arrived, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. What it looked like when the Europeans arrived in Asia, so looking at Asia, and finally what were some of the religious and political systems going on in Asia prior to and during the initial European arrival there. Some key terms that you're going to see: plantation, triangular trade, the Middle Passage, and bureaucracy. Okay, so take a look for those in your reading especially, and we'll be dealing with those in your assignment. So let's get started. Let's take a look at the growth of the slave trade. Remember, we have Europeans going over to America, wanting the raw materials from America in order to bring those back and refine them in Europe. So somebody's got to do all that work, and they decide that the Native Americans are too few to really do massive amounts of work. So where are we going to take these people from? It turns out that the Europeans solved that problem by looking to Africa. So African slaves are valued laborers, and they're brought over to North and South American plantations. And this becomes what's called the triangular trade. So slaves from Africa to America, raw materials from America to Europe, finished materials from Europe to Africa and America. That's the triangle, as you can see kind of on the graphic here on this slide. They figure that as many as 10 million slaves were brought to the Americas between the 1500s and the 1800s. Just to give you an idea, that's about 5 times the population of Las Vegas. So think about Vegas, multiply it by 5, that's the number of individuals that were forcibly brought over from their homes to the Americas without any consent. Where did they get these slaves from? Well, predominantly it was in West Africa. That was the easiest point. The currents moved directly down from Europe to West Africa. They could make a quick stop before heading across the Atlantic. African European slaves, there were generally dealers that would raid local villages. Sometimes those were Africans themselves that would go in, round up some people from villages, bring them to the coast, and sell them to the European slavers. Generally, we see that the slave trade initially starts on the coast, because that's where the ships are. It makes perfect sense. And as individuals become scarce on the coast, they move inland over time. They come to market in the coastal cities in Africa, and then they're put on boats and sent over to North and South America. And that trip, which is known as the Middle Passage, the passage across the Atlantic, was probably one of the most grueling and inhumane things that has ever been done to a group of people. We have ships, European ships, that slaves are packed into like cargo. There's no desire looking at health. There's no looking at hygiene. It's just how many bodies can you literally shove into a ship. and then they're taken across the ocean on long voyages, sometimes up to a month of a voyage, and the death rate was horrific. As soon as they landed, they're in a new part of a new world that they do not have resistance to some of the diseases that were in North and South America, and many died because of that. So the Middle Passage, they lost a lot of individuals just because of the arduous nature of the journey, but those that did arrive in North and South America were then sold to the individual plantation owners. Back in Africa, though, we need to understand that there was strong political systems long before the Europeans arrived. It was not just a backwards continent. There were some incredible kingdoms with higher learning and strong structures that were going on a long time. And you had, that was broken down. Some were highly centralized nations, kind of like we think of the United States as having a central point around Washington, D.C., and then everything's focused to that. And some were independent city-states, kind of like what we saw during the Renaissance in Europe. And many of these nations had strong trade relationships with the Europeans. They would sell some of their goods in order to get some of the European goods as well. When the initial foreign influence occurred in Africa, we generally saw it along the coast. Ships would come down from Portugal or Spain or Britain, and they would trade with coastal empires, for materials that had maybe been brought from the inland of Africa, but rarely were there anything set up in inland Africa. It was just too hard to get there for the Europeans. There was a good deal of European influence, though, with religion. And not only was that the Christian religion, but also Islam. The Muslim religion was very, very strong, especially in North and East Africa, due to Middle Eastern influences. And we saw Christianity a factor in parts of Africa, but generally not a major one, usually just in South Africa. For the most part, their local religions were the ones that were most important to them. Let's switch over to Asia now, take a look at the Asian continent. Remember that the Portuguese go around the Horn of Africa, and they desire to connect with Asia in order to continue this trade in spices. Spices are an incredibly important thing in Europe at the time, and so we now have growing trade with Asia because of it. We certainly saw that there were strong Asian nations as well. And here's a picture of one from Cambodia called Angkor Wat. There were millions and millions of people in China and India, and so there were a lot of things going on before we saw the Europeans arrive on the scene. But when they did arrive, generally it was the Portuguese and the Dutch that made the first contact with Southeast Asia, and they were focusing on the spice trade. That's what they were interested in. That's the area, generally India and also what we think of today as Indonesia were the focal points for that. While the Portuguese were more interested in trading and leaving, the Dutch actually were interested in developing some permanent colonies in Southeast Asia. And so some of the areas in this part of the world actually have a big connection with the Dutch. You don't think of the Netherlands, which is what we call that area today, being connected with Asia, but they certainly were, and it was because of this colonization and trade. What was the impact on Southeast Asia for this contact of cultures? Well, again, much like it was in Africa, we saw an awful lot of the influence being limited to the coast. Didn't get inland very often. It was just too hard. We had trade now, though, with some very new, to European eyes anyway, civilizations. The Thai, the Vietnamese, and the Burmese became something that the Europeans knew about and started to trade with. And many of these areas were resistant to colonization by the Europeans. They did not want to become a colony of Europe. In terms of the religious and political systems that were evolved in Southeast Asia, they were very strong. Christianity, brought over by the Europeans, did start to gain a toehold, but not nearly as much as the Muslim religion. Again, Muslim traders had been trading well before the Europeans had with this part of the world because of the spices. And with the trade, they also brought their religious beliefs. So much of this area, like Indonesia today, is a Muslim nation. We don't think of that. It seems odd that Southeast Asia would be that way, but it certainly is. And it's because, again, of this trade that happened long, long ago. Buddhism, the belief of the Buddha, is very strong inland, but not nearly as strong on the coastlines. And we see that generally the political power resides with the kings. So we have lots of different kings at various levels that are holding the power. So they haven't moved to some sort of a democratic government, but neither has Europe by this time. So that's a little bit about what's going on with the external relationship between Europe and Asia and Africa. So use this, your reading, to finish up your material. Next week we'll be also giving you a little overview of what's happening with a semester project, or excuse me, a quarter project, so you'll take a look at that as well. So have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.